Hello and welcome to Good Nightmare, a podcast where staying up past our bedtime isn't always a choice. If you've been listening for a while or you follow me on social media, you'll know that axe murders, for some strange reason, are some of my favourites to explore. Not necessarily because of the murders themselves, but because an axe is a very peculiar weapon. It's more intimate than a gun, but a lot more brutal than a knife. As a heads up, today's episode is particularly violent, and it does involve the murder of children and the mention of sexual assault against a child. So if this is a topic that you're not comfortable with, I am perfectly happy for you to skip this episode or proceed with caution. As with all Good Nightmare episodes, I try to keep the gruesome details to a minimum, except where they're necessary to the detailing of a crime. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders. The Villisca Axe Murders took place on June 9, 1912 in Iowa. The Moore family included Josiah and Sarah Moore, parents to Herman Montgomery, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, and Paul Vernon, 5. They were an affluent and well-known family, well-liked by their community and involved in the local church. The weekend of the murders, the family was hosting guests, Ina May, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12. Sarah and the children visited the Presbyterian church on the night of the 9th. The children attended the Children's Day program, which Sarah presided over. The program ended at 9:30 p.m, and with a short walk home, the family returned to their house by 10. There were no reports of any disturbances or unusual behaviour on this night. The following morning, on June 10 at 7 a.m, neighbour Mary Peckman was concerned to see that the usually punctual family had not appeared around the house for their morning chores. Mary approached the home and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, she tried the handle, but it was locked. There was nothing she could do at this point to rouse the family from their apparent sleep, so she let the chickens out and called Josiah's brother for assistance. Noting Mary's concern, Josiah's brother arrived at the house shortly after. He tried knocking and turning the door handle to no avail, so used his spare key to enter the home. What he would find was unfathomable. Ina and Lena's bodies were discovered in the guest bedroom in a gruesome scene. Roy Moore immediately sent Mary Peckman to call the town peace officer, Hank Horton. The search continued upon Hank's arrival, and the rest of the family was discovered. Each family member had been bludgeoned to death with an axe belonging to Josiah himself. The axe had been left in the guest room by the bodies of the two young guests. Given the family's recorded arrival at their home around 10 p.m. and their inability to be called forth from the home around 7 a.m, it was determined that the murders took place somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning. Officers found 2 smoked cigarettes in the attic, which led them to believe that whomever had murdered the family and their guests had waited inside the house for them to arrive home. It was determined that Sarah and Josiah had been killed first, while sleeping. Sarah and the other victims had all been bludgeoned with the blunt side of the axe, whereas Josiah had been attacked with the blade. Josiah was attacked so severely that his eyes were missing, having been destroyed. This lends to the idea that either Josiah was considered enough of a threat to the killer to put a stop to the murders that he needed to be taken out, so to speak, or that this attack was specifically targeted towards the destruction of Josiah and his family consequently. The Moore's children were attacked next, and lastly, the 2 guests. All residents of the home were determined to have been asleep at the time of the attacks, except for Lena. Lena had a defensive wound on her arm that suggested she woke up during the attack and may have tried to fight back. Her nightgown was found pushed up, and her underwear was missing when her body was found, suggesting an attempted assault. While there was minimal evidence, there was an abundance of suspects. Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, William Mansfield, Loving Mitchell, Henry Lee Moore of no relation, and Andy Sawyer were all investigated as suspects in the murder. I'll let you decide which suspect you feel most fits the crime. And if you have other theories, please be sure to share them in the Facebook group. Reverend George Kelly was a travelling minister who was in town at the time of the murders. He was known for being peculiar and mentally unwell, and was a suspected peeping Tom. Kelly was in attendance at the church on June 8, as he'd come to teach the Children's Day service, and so could be connected to the Moores in this way. Kelly left town around 5 a.m. June 10, the morning after the murders. Kelly actually confessed to the crime, but he wasn't believed. He showed a remarkable interest in the case and stayed in contact with investigators, claiming to have been at least a witness. In 1914, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene images via mail to a secretary he had been consistently sexually harassing. He was subsequently sent to St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital for treatment and detainment. In 1917, Kelly was arrested for the axe murders of the Themoore family. He confessed to the crime but recanted shortly thereafter and was acquitted at his second trial. Frank F. Jones was a local resident. He was also a previous employee of Josiah's, and it was rumoured that he had been involved in a sexual affair with one of Moore's family members. This, combined with bad business experiences between the two, led to the rumour that there was bad blood between the pair. The rumours, however, were unfounded. William Mansfield was a suspected serial killer. 2 years after the Villisca Axe Murders, Mansfield murdered his own wife, infant child, and in-laws. He was also a suspect believed to have committed the 1912 Paola, Kansas axe murders. The crime scenes were both accessible by train, and it was suggested that this was how he moved around to commit various crimes. These axe murders were also said to have been linked to the New Orleans axe murders. Mansfield was released from custody, having given a solid alibi for his whereabouts at the time of the murders. Henry Lee Moore, of no relation to the victims, was also a suspected serial killer. He murdered his own mother and grandmother just months before the Villisca Axe murders. And as with Mansfield, was suspected in a slew of axe murders that had taken place around the same time, though it appears his connection to the case wasn't quite strong enough. Suspect Andrew Sawyer was a transient. He travelled from place to place and stopped for work as he went. At 6 a.m, the day the bodies were discovered, Sawyer approached a foreman looking for work. He was wet and muddy, and noted as being very interested in the murders. He would read articles about the murders alone on break, and would mention them to other workers. Sawyer was said to be anxious about being alone, and he would often sleep with an axe by his side. Naturally, his fellow crewmen were wary of him. Afraid of being considered a suspect, Sawyer attempted to leave Villisca. though he seemed to have information about the crime, including how the murderer may have escaped the scene and skipped town. He was released from custody. He had a solid alibi. He'd been arrested for vagrancy the night of the murders and had been sent out of town at about 11 p.m, an hour before the murders were said to have taken place. Though who's to say the timelines weren't slightly off? Any one of these suspects, well, almost any of them, could easily be linked to the case. However, even with all of these strong cases against the suspects mentioned, the case remains unsolved. There is plenty of speculation as to who committed this crime, and it's not just limited to the suspects that I mentioned. Bill James and Rachel McCarthy, in their novel The Man from the Train, look at a series of axe murders that took place over 10 years, including the Villisca Axe Murders. In their novel, they conclude that Paul Mueller was the perpetrator of each and every murder. However, the pair admit that they only had about 500 words of information about the man's skills, appearance, and family. Not exactly much to go on, and really not too much of a case. However, regardless of who you believe is the killer, this novel would be an interesting read if you're keen for mass consumption of detailed axe murders. I may have to keep an eye out for it myself. So who do you think the killer is? Do you believe it's one of the suspects mentioned or someone else entirely? Feel free to share your theories in the Facebook group, Good Nightmare Pod, or contact me on social media. You can find me at goodnightmare_s on Instagram and Twitter. Alternatively, you can send me an email at goodnightmare_s@outlook.com, whether it's about this case or just for a chat. Thank you, as always, so much for listening. If you have time to rate on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, subscribe and or leave a review, it would be greatly appreciated. It really helps me grow my audience and reach new listeners. And given how many of my listeners have become friends, I'm always happy for more people to interact with. Stay tuned for a podcast recommendation at the end of this episode. And until next time, sweet dreams.
Hello all, I'm Paul, creator and host of the True Crime Enthusiast podcast. I've been a crime buff for many years now, and my enthusiasm has led its way here. If you fancy each week delving into some obscure but in-depth and often disturbing true crime tales from the shores of the UK, plus you don't mind the northern accent and the down-to-earth manner, then why not come have a nosy? The show can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much wherever you get your podcasts from. So it'd be great if you guys could come and have a look-see, and I hope you can subscribe today. I'd love you to join me, and I look forward to seeing you there too. See if you can become enthusiastic about the True Crime Enthusiast podcast.